Well, good morning, Finland. I am so excited to be here in Helsinki. I come from Washington, D.C. in the United States, and when I heard they were going to have impeachment trials this week, I said, where can I go to get as far away from that as possible? And I had this wonderful opportunity to come and see you here. So I think we have a couple of Slido questions here, so if you are going to use Slido, go ahead and go and answer some of those questions. It's not necessarily central to my talk today, but it is always useful for me to understand what the experience is of the people in the room today. So, have you ever used a voice assistant on a smartphone? This is different, obviously, than smart speakers. A lot of people have done that, so we'll get a few folks who are entering in that right now. All right, so a lot of people have used some of these different ones. And, all right, so Apple Siri, pretty popular. Okay, let's move on to the next one, if you guys don't mind, the Slido folks, who's ever controlling that. Have you ever used voice commands in a car? As a bonus here, does anybody know the first car with an actual voice assistant, voice interaction? I was speaking in Munich a little while ago, and people said Kit from Knight Rider, but that was fictional. Anyone want to guess the year the first car with a voice assistant showed up? Come on, give me a year. Somebody. Nobody knows what years there are. 2000, Jaguar S-Type. Was the first voice assistant. I did this in a presentation in Germany not too long ago, and someone yelled out, Ford in 2004, and I said, no, Jaguar S-Type. He's like, oh, I forgot I worked on that project. So if you think about voice is not necessarily something very new, it's something that's been around for a long time. Okay, so a number of people have used a voice assistant in the car. Let's go to the final one. When we think about voice, a lot of people are familiar with that through customer service, call centers, and that's not been a great experience for a lot of people. When we start looking at voice assistants, one of the things we're going to talk about today, everything from Amazon Alexa and Google Home to custom voice assistants has been a very different experience for people, usually very positive. Okay, this is about what I would have expected. There's a few people who have used Google Home, a few used Alexa. If I were in the States at a conference like this, the numbers would be 65, 70% have used these things. So very different, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And one of the things that I find when I'm speaking in Europe about voice assistants is they're generally, most of the countries are about 2 to 3 years behind the US in terms of adoption, but they all have a very similar adoption pattern. Okay, so if we can go to the presentation now. So I think in your original conference programs, it said we were going to talk about UX today. I'm not going to talk as much about UX today because that's really a how question. And given the amount of adoption here, we really want to talk a little bit about why and what is going on in this space. And so I want to give you a sense of what's going on with voice right now globally, and then we can apply it to here, what you're doing here in the Nordics. And I know there's a number of you from throughout Europe, and then you can get a perspective of what you're likely to see in the next couple of years. How many people here have heard of Voicebot.ai? A few of you. Not nearly enough. You all have phones, and we have great Wi-Fi here, voicebot.ai. You can imagine how to get there. If you really want to know anything about voice, we are actually the #1 source for voice information globally. Academics use us, news organizations use us. And one of the things we're going to talk about here is around the adoption of voice by the big tech platforms. I have a Harvard Business Review article in there, so if you just type in Bret Kinsella at hbr.org, you'll be able to learn more, go a little bit deeper than we're talking today. So, has anybody here heard of the term singularity? The singularity? Yeah, there's a few. So, robot overlords taking over the world. I was at CES a few weeks ago, and they've got a lot of robots. CES, Consumer Electronics Show in the US in Las Vegas, big thing. 180,000 people come together to talk about future. It's kind of like IFA of the US. And there's robots everywhere, and they had this robot greeting people at this event. And as you can see there, a self-driving car came along, and that's what happened to the robot. So If you're worried about the singularity, think cars, not robots, okay? Self-driving cars is probably the more dangerous thing that we have out there right now. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is global activity and in voice. And I think about, I've been doing this since the 90s. I know I'm older than a lot of the people in this room. There's a few, I see a couple of you are as old as me, maybe older. And in the 90s, we were looking at the web, and then we had mobile and social and RFID and all these other types of things that came along in my career. But one of the things I've seen is a lot of false hope in new technologies. And so I always look at the data. I look at the adoption data by consumers to figure out if this is a real thing. So we hear a lot about AR and VR, right? They haven't really had the consumer adoption data so that we can see maybe those will be something in the future, but they're not something of now in terms of scale. But when we look at voice, we're already starting to see scale. And the first thing I want to talk to you about is distribution. So this is the voice assistant installed base, and we're talking about consumer voice assistants. So these are the Google, the Apple, the Siri, the Microsoft Cortana. So you can see up here, this all adds up to about 2.5 billion devices. We're almost at 3 billion devices worldwide that provide access to a voice assistant. So that's the first thing we have to think about. Can people access the new technology? Is it out there? Now, there's also a difference between pre-installed and actual use. And one of the things that we heard this year at Consumer Electronics Show from Google is that of the billion-plus devices with Google Assistant, 500 million are using it monthly. So now we're starting to see a new technology that not only has broad distribution, but regular usage. And when you look at Amazon, they have a much smaller footprint, but actually their usage base is even much higher. Of that 200 million plus, that we're probably looking at 80 or 90% of those are monthly active users, because a lot of those devices, that's the only way you can interact with it. There's no other reason to have those devices. So that's the first thing I want to tell you about. These devices are everywhere, and we're starting to see a lot of regular use. Now, a lot of people will hear about smart speakers. So a few of you, very few of you in this room have a smart speaker based on the Slido presentation, but they're actually very popular worldwide. So we had 200 million shipped just this last year. Think about that. In 2016, 3 years prior, there were 13 million shipped worldwide, 200 million this year. That'll probably go to 350 million this year. They're very popular devices. They have a number of use cases that people want. Really important for anybody who's a marketer in the room. There's a new endpoint in the home where you can actually reach and interact with consumers. So keep that in mind. And it's not just China and the US and maybe part of Western Europe that's doing this, but in the Nordic countries, my friends at Strategy Analytics were able to put together some data for me and show that about 900,000 smart speakers were sold in the Nordic countries. Now, this is primarily Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Finland, I'm not aware of any specific voice assistant or smart speaker here. If you know of one, let me know. I'd like to add that to some of our research, because we do global research on this. But you talk about this idea that in the Nordics, about a little over 1 million smart speakers have been sold. So that's probably something like 700,000 to 800,000 people in the Nordics have smart speakers in their home. Some of them have more than one, and that accounts for the difference in overage. Now, if we look at some select Western countries, I put together some of the data here, also from Strategy Analytics, a great source of data if you're looking for it in this space. In this case, we're not talking about speakership, we're talking about households. So how many people have access to these in their home? And you can see the UK is the most advanced. They've had it, they in Germany have had it the longest, over 21%. These numbers are from June. That's going to be about 25% right now as of January 2020 in the UK. So when you start talking about a technology that's that pervasive in UK households or any households in any country, you start to talk about something that's mass adoption. In the US, by the way, that's a much higher number. But before we get to the US, I do want to look at the adoption amplitude of these different countries. Pretty steep, okay? And so a lot of people talk about smart speakers being the most quickly adopted technology since mobile or the iPhone, smartphones. In that way, it is that. Tapering off a little bit, but still very steep adoption curve because they provide new value. Now in the US, which really was the incubator for these new technologies, what we see is 2 years ago, we had about 47 million, this is people using this as US adults. Last year at 66 million, so it went up about 19 million. Almost 40% growth. This year, we still had 31% growth. We're up over 85 million, so about another 20 million. So smart speakers are a really interesting story here. One of the things that we find is that once somebody has a smart speaker, they start using voice more on other surfaces. So for example, their smartphones. And so in this way, smart speakers have their own value in the home, completely different type of solution that we've had in the past, but they also are essentially training wheels as we think about this, or a way to prime users to start thinking about using voice more on other surfaces. Once you start using voice, you tend to use it more everywhere, not just on the smart speaker. But we want to make sure that we talk about this as not just smart speakers. So if you look in the US, is another good example. This is from the end of September. We had about 76 million smart speakers. People had smart speakers that tried them, and on smartphone, and more than double. So when you start thinking about this, there's actually a lot more people, even on a monthly basis, using on these other surfaces in the car, on the phone, than in the smart speaker. But what you also see is that once you have a smart speaker, you use it more on a monthly basis. And so this tends to be a self-reinforcing adoption cycle. And really what we learn here in terms of all this data is that microphones are now everywhere. Certainly this is true in the US and most of Western Europe. I think will soon be true in Finland and the Nordics, as this adoption grows. And when we think about the global voice assistants that I think people are most familiar with, I like to point out we've got these 5 big ones. So we've got Samsung with Bixby, but mostly they're serving the Western countries. And then we've got Alexa from Amazon, Google Assistant, Cortana from Microsoft, and we have Apple Siri, which a lot of people are familiar with. And these are essentially the countries that they support. So Finland, obviously not supported here with localization, but I know there are people here that are using English language or other language versions of that. But we also see this rise of regional voice assistants. So a lot of countries, a lot of companies in these countries that have deep relationships around localization and different types of services are building their own voice assistants. So don't let anybody tell you this is just a story of Amazon, Google, and Apple. There's a lot of other players out there. So we think about in Germany, Magenta. In France, we've got Jingo. Obviously in China, it's a completely different story where we don't have, except for Apple Siri, we don't have any of the large Western solutions there today. We've got Alibaba, and we have Xiaomi, and Baidu have really significant there. And then also, one of the great success stories that almost nobody ever talks about is in Russia, we have Yandex has Alice. And so that's been really popular over time. And I think every bit as dominant there, and maybe more so than maybe Alexa or Google are in some of these other countries. So here's the landscape. If you want to think about all the different types of consumer voice assistants that are out there today, we've got very significant coverage. There's a couple of gaps there in South America and Africa, but in general, it is a global phenomenon. Okay, so we think about this like smart speakers. It is moving wide across the globe. It's not going to be specific to a single culture, a specific region like some technology adoptions are, and that's one of the things that makes it really popular. Okay, so then the question is, why is this happening now? Because there's a lot of technologies that come along, and it's just not the right time. And in fact, voice has been that. In fact, in the late 1990s, they were saying voice was going to be the next big thing. It's going to be the internet and then voice. But there was a couple of key things missing. And a lot of that was the technology. So first of all, the advent of the cloud and elastic computing was really critical to this. There's all this talk about edge-based computing, and that's an important trend. But most of what's going on with voice, most of the AI driven with voice is cloud-based, and that's been really important because we have this other idea of neural nets. So deep neural nets, if you're a technologist, you might be excited about this. That's something where we replicate the human brain and how that works in computing, and that's something that has been around for about 25 years, but we didn't have the compute power in order to be able to take full advantage of it like we've had over the last several years. And then we have these other terms like automated speech recognition, natural language understanding, and natural language generation. Builds on this idea of the cloud and elastic computing in order to be able to make this all possible today. What that has led to is, first, we'll talk about this user interface evolution. So a lot of people in here are probably familiar with this idea that every 10 years we seem to have a new user interface. It was the mouse, then we had touch on the smartphones, and now we have voice on all these other surfaces. So we have this idea of, okay, we have click, we have touch, we have speak, And there's a couple things that I like to point out to people. So first of all, when in the 90s, when we were going from analog to digital, we didn't have any digital content. So we had to create it all. It was not just, we didn't have to just learn a new platform. We had to create all the content for it. When we went to mobile, we had the digital content, but we had to reformat it for different types of use cases and different screen sizes, those types of things. Anybody in UX will understand that. When we moved to voice, it's more like the analog to digital shift, because we don't actually have a lot of conversational and audio content, at least audio content that's suitable for this type of back and forth in a conversational interaction. And so, think about that. We actually have to develop an entirely new set of content. And so anybody who is a service provider, an agency, it's like a full employment act for all of you people in here. There's plenty of work to be done. This is the shift that's going on, and we're going to need to generate a lot of this new content to work on this new user interface. Now, we also, when we think about these tech platform evolutions, we talk about not just the interface, but often we're talking about a device or some other type of thing that it's bound to. So with a PC, we had the web. We couldn't really get the web without a PC. Those of you who remember in the 90s when you first got these on their desk, but it's also been true up until more recently. The cloud really would not have taken off without, mobile really would not have taken off without the cloud, because we're delivering most of that content from the cloud in some way to keep the updates there. And if we look at voice, it really wouldn't work without AI. Now, however, there's a difference here. Voice is device independent. If we look at those previous two platform shifts, they were device dependent. So there was a device like a computer, and you had a web browser. There was a smartphone, and you had, and then you had this all the apps that you could access here. When we talk about voice apps, voice assistants, they actually exist across all these different services. So it's not really dependent on someone just buying a device. It's actually in the devices today that they already own. The other thing that's different is the assistant is the first time, voice with assistants, is the first time we have an intermediary. So in the other platforms, we would go directly through the browser or through mobile. We would go to the website or we'd go to the app. So we would self-service ourselves into what we were looking for. With voice, there's actually this assistant. We have to ask the assistant that then funnels us to the place we're asking for. So this is very different. And this is the reason why all of the giants of tech really care about this. Because they have this essential digital concierge that's an intermediary between the end user and the content, they all want to be that intermediary because they don't trust their rivals to be that intermediary. Okay, and so when we think about this, these giant companies are spending billions of dollars a year because they see a platform shift, and they know because many of them made their businesses on a previous platform shift. Okay? And so I have some examples here of what's important in a platform shift. Availability, think of that as distribution. Can people access content? And then we have acquisition. So acquisition is like, that's purchasing. So can I do commerce? And that's what we're here to talk about today. Authority, who has the source of information that everybody trusts? And then attention, who's dominating the amount of time that consumers are spending on this. And so you can see in some of these previous platforms, there were clear winners. There wasn't really an availability winner in the web because it's open and everyone has equal access. But we had gatekeepers when we went to mobile. So we had Google and Apple, and that was really, and you had to go through them. But once you got through them, you could actually do pretty much what you want. Amazon's done well in the purchasing in the first two rounds. There's a couple other countries. If you're in China, the answer would be Alibaba. But there's a few different folks who have done really well in that space and become dominant in that commerce space for these previous two platforms and actually built their business because of the platform shift. These would not be companies that we even talked about if these platform shifts didn't happen. Authority, obviously, Google has really moved along, but we see that Apple and mobile, because of its position, actually developed some of that authority and controlled some of that information flow. Amazon's doing that today. That's one of the great advantages of having this position and this new platform. Attention didn't really exist until we had mobile because, like, if you're tethered to a PC, you can't really control someone's attention all the day. But when you think about who won the mobile wars, we had Google with Android, we had Apple with iOS, and we absolutely had Facebook on mobile and the apps because they were just dominant in that. And that company was built on mobile as much as it was doing well on the web beforehand. It's really mobile that moved it up. And then obviously with WhatsApp and Instagram and its acquisitions, it's done even better. When we get into voice assistants, There's another concept called agency. So it's not just controlling those other 4 A's that I just talked about, but there's also this idea that voice assistants can do something on your behalf. Has anybody in here heard of Google Duplex? Raise your hand if you have. Simon has. Not many people. Okay, Google Duplex is a service from Google where you can ask the assistant to make a hair salon or restaurant reservation for you. And you just say what you want, and it'll go out and find it for you. It'll go to the place, it'll make a phone call, and it'll actually talk, the Google Duplex, the assistant, will talk to the person on the other end of the line, and will make the reservation for you. And if the time that you want isn't right, it'll essentially negotiate a time. Say, oh, it can't do it at 11 a.m.? Okay, could you do it at noon, right? And it'll do that, and when it completes the transaction, we'll come back to the person and say, it's already booked and this is the time. So you think about it, it's doing something on your behalf. And so they really care about this. This is the first time assistants now are going to make decisions. And anybody involved in commerce, that means that assistants are going to start buying things for people. They're going to say, oh, I need this thing, right? And it'll go out and find the best deal. It might find the best brand. It might switch brands for you. It might actually learn your behavior. In fact, will probably learn your behavior about certain types of things and just order things for you, and it'll just show up. And then you'll be happy because you wouldn't have to think about it, right? So this is like a tremendous change, and everyone here really needs to think about this in terms of how it's going to change the way that they interact with consumers. And I'll say this whole idea of agency, I don't know if anybody recognizes what this is. It's called Bali. It was just announced at CES. It's a couple years away from Samsung. But again, it's like a little robot that looks like a little ball that rolls around the house. The key thing is it does things for you while you're away at work or not in the home. It actually patrols the home and will do some things for you. So this whole idea of agency, doing things on behalf of the consumer, is a really big point. Now, what we've talked about is these folks in this upper right-hand corner, Alexa and Google Assistant. These are the big consumer assistants. But I also want you to leave here today understanding this is only part of the discussion that we're having when we think about voice. Because essentially, those are all platform controlled. They determine what you can do. Let's say you're a brand. They determine what you can do, how you can expose yourself to consumers. But they have a really broad feature scope. From a consumer standpoint, I can actually ask for just about anything. And sometimes it can't answer the question, but increasingly it can do a lot of things for you. But when we started analyzing this market, I started seeing other things come up that were more and more important. So we have this idea of these niche players that are kind of like the general purpose solutions, but they're just for something very specific. Like there's a company out of New Zealand called Aider.ai. It's for small business. All the back office things, accounting, HR, taxes, all these types of things. They now have a voice assistant that will connect to all the really popular back-end small business software packages, and you can just have a voice interface on top of them. Then we have this idea of owned. You build it yourself. Right, so you have that in your organization. You're not dependent on Google or Amazon. You don't have to send them your data. You can make it just what you want. And then we have these white label solutions that allow you to do a very similar type of thing, but they give you the package so you can more configure it as an end user. And so one of the biggest trend that I see going on right now in the US, which, as I said, is 2 to 3 years ahead of where we see things continually pop up in other parts of the world, is this bottom area where people are building their own, either using a white label solution like Houndify or Nuance or Cerence, or they're actually just putting all the technology components together to build something really custom. And what I want you to take away from this is when you think about voice, don't just think about Amazon, Google, Apple, okay? So Amazon, Google, Apple, and some of these niche players, what I think about that is channels. If you were connecting with consumers, think about that as a new channel because they are aggregating large numbers of consumers, and consumers are increasingly relying on these assistants. You need to have a presence. If you do not have a presence in those areas, then you are literally silent. What happens when you are silent? Then Google or Amazon decides when someone asks about your brand, how to dispose of that question. So if you have a presence on those, then you actually are in that conversation. That's important. However, when you think about voice from a strategic level, you also want to think about the capabilities. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what this means. Bank of America in the US, they have 8 million users have tried their Erica voice assistant. It's through their mobile app. About 500,000 of them are monthly active users. So you see the numbers there. They've done 55 million transactions. This is a significant enhancement to the feature offering that they have on their mobile banking app, right? So you think about how bloated a lot of these applications have become, particularly on mobile. It's harder and harder for you to figure out what it is that or where you can find the service that you need. They can add new services, which are AI-driven, but also just make it easier to find what's already there and reduce calls to the call center and all these other types of things. But more importantly, they want to raise consumer loyalty. Mercedes, the MBUX or Hey Mercedes system, really sophisticated. They actually have multiple assistants behind the Hey Mercedes assistant, which is like hands off the queries to different areas. But for them, they want to have that total control. What they're seeing is Apple and Google are asserting more control over the user experience in the car. This is an opportunity for them to have their own voice assistant to create a uniquely Mercedes experience so they can control that. In France and Germany, we've got Jingo and Magenta. So a couple of large telecom companies, really media companies, because they have television and other types of services that they provide. They didn't want to, again, just cede the entire ground to Google. So they said, hey, we're going to have our own voice assistant, our own smart speaker for the home, which will allow us to create much more integrated experiences and robust experiences for our consumers. Now, by the way, on both of these devices, you can actually activate Alexa and the Jingo or Magenta, but only about a third of the people actually activate Alexa too. Most of the people are just using these devices today for the services provided by Orange and Deutsche Telekom. And then if you look at BBC, one of the most aggressive adopters of voice assistant technology through Google Assistant and Amazon Alexa, they announced last year that they're going to be rolling out their own voice assistant because it's going to create a much more rich and varied voice user experience for its consumers, allow them to do a lot more than just having to pass everything off to Google and Amazon. However, they are going to maintain that. So again, this whole channel concept, they're still using that, but they're also having this deeper experience about having more capabilities. I thought I'd throw up another example here for those of you in healthcare. We have these in-home assistants now. So this one actually will do pill dispensing as well, at the right time for the person throughout the day. Acts as in some ways a companion for people who are aging at home and they're all alone. There's a lot of things here. So if you have this opportunity, what I want to do is I want you to come away from this understanding that there's wide and broad adoption of voice assistants, and these giant companies are creating large consumer user groups that if you want to have access to them, you need to participate in those as a channel, just as you had to do on mobile, just as you had to do on social, and it's very much like social. So a lot of you had presence on Twitter or on Facebook because that's where your customers were. You need to do that here with voice as well. It's just some different players this time around. But then also when you look at the technology and what voice assistants can do, really think deeply about how you can change the way you interact with consumers by having your own voice assistant. And a couple of years ago, this was very expensive. It might cost you, Bank of America spent about $60 million building Erica just a couple years ago. You can spend a tenth of that now using one of these white label solutions, and that's going to come down another tenth within the next couple years because people have said, oh, I can provide these voice assistants for large enterprises much more simply by providing them all the tools that they need. And so I want to close just on one more point. And I think it needs to be stressed here that something's very different about voice. Now, we talked about this idea that, there's agency, right? So there's this concierge or this assistant, this intermediary we haven't heard in the past. It's going to do things for you. We talked about the fact that it's device independent. And those are I think, mechanical differences between the previous platform shifts, right? And we know that this is important because platform shifts make or break these big companies, right? And they provide new opportunities. But when we come to voice, there's something actually a little bit more fundamental that's different that I think explains why, in part, consumers have adopted a lot of these technologies so quickly. And the first, if we just go back, we think about what technology was. In the past, we always had to go to the technology. And even more importantly, we had to learn the language of the technology. Does anybody know what this is? Yeah, there's a few people. All the people with gray hair. Okay, so they know what this is. This is a punch card. This is how you used to communicate with computers. You would actually have to put it in. This was the program, right? If you think about it, let's just think about a different type of technology, a car. The steering wheel, the accelerator, the brake, that is the language of the car. So in the past, anytime we interacted with technology, we had to learn the language of that technology. Voice is the first time when the technology actually understands us. We can communicate in the language that we are most comfortable with, that we've learned, and then the technology actually understands that, and that's leading to all sorts of new use cases, and it's also leading to changes in the previous use cases that we're already comfortable with. And I'll just leave this with you. If you want to learn more about this, so we have like a free website. We do news, 60 articles a month. You can learn a lot on voicebot.ai if you want more depth. I have these hour-long conversations with the people who are actually building these technologies. The podcast, we have free reports up there, and then we have also a newsletter that goes much deeper if you're inside the industry and you really want to know the story behind the story. And we have these other research services, Voicebot Research, where we go really deep with these 50-page reports. So there's a lot of resources out there if you want to learn this. This is happening. So what I tell you is that I see it. I spend a lot of time in different countries around the world. It's happening everywhere, and it's going to fundamentally change the way we interact with technology. In the past, we had to go to the technology. Now we can interact with the technology anywhere we want. Thank you.